Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her the first time he saw Katie Morrison in the break room, and the words landed exactly as intended, a dismissal disguised as a statement of fact. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She just poured her coffee and walked out, leaving the comment hanging in the air like a scalpel someone had dropped on the tile floor. They didn't know who she was. He had no idea what was standing in his hospital, wearing scrubs from Target and a name badge from Orientation, with hands that had held lives together on 3 continents. The next 72 hours would change that. What happened after would end careers. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Medical Center in Norfolk hum overhead in a frequency most people stop hearing after the first week. Katie Morrison had been working in this hospital for 8 months, and she still heard it, that constant electrical drone like a machine counting down to something neither of them could name yet. 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the ER hallway smells like antiseptic and yesterday's fear, that particular hospital stench that no amount of bleach can entirely erase. Her scrubs are still damp from the pre-dawn rain that hammered the parking lot like it had a personal vendetta against the asphalt. Room for 12 is on the 4th floor, the quieter unit, where the long-term patients live out their medical purgatory in rooms that smell like recirculated air and adjusted expectations. Katie has been assigned to 4-star General Marcus Hale for the past 3 months, and his chart reads like a soldier's obituary written in medical shorthand. IED blast, Bagram Airfield, 24 months in a coma, minimal responsiveness, extensive spinal cord trauma, pneumonia complications at month 18, stable but not improving. The general's daughter visits on Sundays and cries quietly in the visitor's chair. His wife stopped visiting 9 months ago. Katie doesn't judge her for it. The general lies in the bed with the particular stillness of someone whose body has forgotten it's supposed to move. His left arm is positioned at his side, the skin mottled with the early signs of pressure ulcer formation despite the Braden scale protocols everyone else follows. Katie looks at the chart clip to the foot of the bed. Last repositioning was at 4 a.m. Incomplete. She sets down her tablet and pulls on fresh gloves, moving to his side with the kind of economy of motion that you only learn when every second counts and you're moving under fire. Her hands move on their own. She doesn't think about the steps, the thought process burned away years ago, replaced with something older and more efficient. She unclamps the left side of the bed rail and supports his hip with her left hand, her right hand sliding under his shoulder blade with the precision of someone who has moved human bodies through worse environments than a hospital room. The muscle memory took over. The repositioning is gentle but firm, rotating his torso forward into a 45-degree turn to redistribute pressure from the sacrum and left hip. She adjusts the pillow under his right side, checks that his left arm won't compress against his body, and then she does something that takes an additional 45 seconds, something no one else on the unit does on any rotation she's observed. She carefully adjusts the angle of his right foot to prevent foot drop, using a rolled towel to maintain neutral ankle positioning. She tightens the restraint slightly to keep the towel from shifting. Standard field protocol for long-term immobility in combat zones. Pressure ulcer prevention in resource-limited environments. Not standard at St. Michael's. Not standard anywhere except places where antibiotics ran out 3 weeks ago and infection meant death. The general's right forearm is exposed as she finishes the repositioning. Tattoo work, faded black ink on tanned skin that hasn't seen sunlight in 2 years. Military needlework, she can tell by the consistency of the line weight. 2 words in stylized lettering, Angel 6. Katie freezes. Not visibly. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. But something in her chest contracts like a fist closing around something that was supposed to stay buried. She knows that call sign. She lowers the bed rail and steps back, her jaw tightening in the way it does when she's processing information that contradicts everything she thought she understood about today. The general's file identifies him as Marcus Hale, 4-star general, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, retired. The tattoo identifies him as someone who served under Katie Morrison during a classified operation that technically never happened, in a location that officially doesn't exist, where she carried 3 men through gunfire on August 14, 2017, including the unconscious sergeant who now lies in this bed with her old call sign marked permanently on his skin. Sergeant Davis. She hasn't heard that name said aloud since her Pentagon debrief, since the conversation where a man in a grey suit explained that her record had been sealed, her death certificates filed, and her entire existence classified at a level she still doesn't have clearance to discuss. She was supposed to be dead in Pentagon files. Dead in newspaper records. Dead everywhere except in the muscle memory of 3 soldiers who survived that day. The heart monitor beeps its steady rhythm. 68 beats per minute. A strong resting rate for a man who hasn't moved in 24 months. Katie places her hand on the general's shoulder, not in a medical capacity, not for assessment or repositioning, but as something closer to contact. She doesn't speak. She learned years ago that some conversations don't require words. Some conversations are just acknowledgement that you both survived something that shouldn't have had survivors. The door to room 412 opens without a knock. Dr. Samuel Pierce enters with his tablet tucked under his left arm and his eyes already scanning the room with the particular intensity of someone looking for evidence of incompetence. He's wearing his white coat, despite the fact that it's Tuesday and he doesn't have clinic until 10 a.m., which means he's made a point to be visible, to be noticed, to establish hierarchy before the day properly begins. The coat is a prop, like everything else about him. He stops in the doorway. His eyes track from Katie's hands, still resting on the general's shoulder, to the adjustment she's made to the positioning, to the towel under the foot. She doesn't move. She doesn't straighten. She doesn't adopt the posture of someone who's been caught doing something wrong because she hasn't. The protocol is solid. The repositioning is standard field medicine applied to a hospital patient, which means it's better than standard hospital medicine could produce. But Pierce's expression changes anyway, a subtle shift in the muscles around his eyes like he's just noticed something that doesn't fit the picture he's assembled about Katie Morrison in the past 3 months. He saw a quiet nurse with steady hands. He saw someone who showed up early, left late, and never challenged the attending physicians. He saw someone who could be managed, whose competence could be controlled through the simple mechanism of institutional hierarchy. What he didn't see was the scarring on her shoulders from shrapnel she took shielding 3 men. What he didn't see was the 7 years of classified training in trauma medicine performed on battlefields where anesthesia was a luxury and amputation was a timer. What he didn't see was the reason her hands moved with such absolute precision. Katie turns to face him, her expression neutral, her eyes clear. The moment passes. Morning rounds. Her voice is even. No inflection. Just a question asked by a junior nurse to her attending physician, the way the hierarchy supposedly works. Pierce doesn't respond immediately. He's studying her face now, trying to assemble information that doesn't quite match the profile he pulled from HR, Katie Morrison. Nursing degree from Virginia Tech, for years experience, came to St. Michael's 8 months ago with a reference from another hospital that was surprisingly sparse on specific accomplishment details. No disciplinary record. No standout performance reviews. No indication of anything but competence, which is what makes the competence so unsettling. Room looks good, he says finally. The words are praise, but they sound like an accusation. He moves into the room fully now, his tablet coming up as if he's checking something, but his eyes are still tracking the details Katie has adjusted. The pressure management protocol. The foot positioning. The angle of the bed. All of it optimal. All of it slightly beyond what anyone else on the floor would have noticed needed adjustment. You've got experience with pressure wound prevention. It's not a question. Katie registers the shift in his voice, the way the words have moved from social pleasantry into something that sounds closer to an interrogation. Standard protocol, she says. The general's file showed early signs of sacral breakdown. The current positioning plan wasn't distributing weight optimally. The current positioning plan was established by nursing staff with more experience. Pierce says it lightly, but there's an edge underneath, sharp as a blade. What made you think a modification was necessary? Katie doesn't look away from his eyes. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. The careful control of someone who knows exactly what she's trained to do and exactly how badly it would end if she did it here, in this hospital, in this fluorescent lit room where protocols and credentials matter more than outcomes. It was necessary, she says quietly, because he was developing pressure ulcers, and my job is to prevent that. Dr. Pierce stares at her for a long moment. His phone vibrates in his coat pocket, and the moment breaks like glass dropped on tile. He glances at the screen, his expression shifting into something approaching frustration. Continue with your rounds, he says, moving back toward the door. He pauses in the frame. But Katie, run modifications through the attending next time. Even if you think they're necessary. She doesn't respond. She just nods, a movement so slight it barely qualifies as acknowledgement. Pierce leaves, and the fluorescent lights hum their endless electrical song, and the heart monitor continues its steady rhythm, and Katie places her hand on Sergeant Marcus Hale's shoulder one more time before moving to the next patient, knowing that something has shifted in the hospital's careful geometry, and that it won't shift back. The morning after the repositioning, Katie arrives at St. Michael's at 5:08 a.m., 30 minutes before shift change, because that's when General Hale sleeps deepest and his body tolerates the gentle passive range of motion exercises that keep his muscles from atrophying entirely. 2 years in a hospital bed teaches the body how to forget itself. She moves his left arm through the shoulder socket with the precision of someone who's done this on a transport helicopter at 3,000 feet, muscle memory guiding her hands through angles and rotations that keep the joint supple, flexible, ready for a body that might wake up. The ventilator hisses its mechanical rhythm as she works, and she's so focused on the subtle resistance of his deltoid that she doesn't hear the footsteps until they're already in the room. Captain Morrison. Not a question. Not a greeting. Katie's hands don't stop moving. The woman standing in the doorway wears dress blues with a colonel's insignia, her shoulders back in a way that suggests she spent her career giving orders to people who actually listen. Her hair is pulled back in a bun so tight it could cut glass, and her eyes, the same storm grey as the general's, move from her father's face to Katie's hands with a kind of attention that reads people the way most nurses read monitors. Colonel Hale, Katie says, completing the final rotation before gently lowering her father's arm back to the bed. Good morning. You're the nurse on this unit. One of them, yes'm. The colonel steps closer to the bed, and the fluorescent lights catch the edge of a silver star pinned to her dress uniform. Katie's pupils dilate fractionally, a tell she can't suppress. She looks away, busying herself with the heart monitor readout, which shows a steady 72 beats per minute, stable as continental bedrock. Repositioning him, Colonel Hale says. Not a question. Range of motion. Prevents muscle contractures. His sternum fracture is healing well, but immobility accelerates atrophy. The blast was 2 years ago. His joints need maintenance. The colonel's jaw tightens. She reaches out and places her hand on her father's shoulder, and something in Katie's chest compresses. The general's eyes remain open but vacant, staring through the acoustic ceiling tiles into whatever distance coma patients inhabit, but his daughter touches him like she's trying to pull him back through sheer force of will. How long has he been like this? The colonel asks. Since Bagram. The IED blast in Loga province. The words hang between them like shrapnel suspended in amber. Colonel Hale's fingers tighten on her father's shoulder. Katie watches the major hospital's standard of care handbook sitting on the rolling cart, its spine cracked from 1,000 quick consultations, and she's about to excuse herself because this is family time, private time, when the door swings inward and Dr. Pierce enters with a kind of momentum that announces his arrival before his body actually crosses the threshold. Nurse Morrison, step away from the patient. Now. The capitalization is in his voice. Katie completes her documentation in one smooth motion, a sentence finished, a pen capped, before she steps back from the bed. Her hands fall to her sides in a posture that's neither defensive nor deferential. Just still. Pierce moves into the space she vacated with the confidence of someone who believes the room reorganizes itself around his presence. His white coat is pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a medal, his name embroidered in script across the chest pocket. He turns to Colonel Hale with the kind of smile that politicians practice in mirrors. Colonel, I sincerely apologize for this display, he says, his voice smooth as warmed honey. Our nurse Morrison here has taken it upon herself to implement some rather unauthorized repositioning protocols. Well-intentioned, certainly, but... He pauses, letting the but hang in the air like a sword. Community college nursing certification doesn't quite prepare one for the complexities of caring for a 4-star general. Limited training, you understand. I've been meaning to have a conversation about scope of practice. Katie doesn't move. She doesn't shift her weight, doesn't cross her arms, doesn't tighten her jaw. She stands with the kind of stillness that comes from having spent years in situations where a visible reaction costs lives. Her heart rate hasn't elevated. Her breathing hasn't changed. Colonel Hale's eyes move from Pierce to Katie and back again, and Katie watches the colonel's hand, still resting on her father's shoulder, begin to tremble. Not from fear. From something else. Something that looks a lot like recognition. Nurse Morrison was performing passive range of motion, the colonel says, her voice flat as a firing range. My father's deltoid shows early signs of contracture. His abductors are weakening. The repositioning is medically necessary. Pierce's smile becomes more fixed. Colonel, I appreciate your concern, but hospital protocol requires. Protocol, Katie says quietly, is written by people who've never treated a sucking chest wound with a flashlight and whatever gauze they found in a Humvee. The room goes still. Not quiet. Still. The kind of atmospheric pressure change that happens when someone speaks a truth that isn't supposed to be spoken out loud. Pierce's face doesn't change, but something in his shoulders tightens. Excuse me. Nothing, doctor. My apologies. Katie's voice is even, calibrated, professional. She's already stepping backward, already moving toward the 4-stand to check the sodium levels, already folding herself back into the role of the nurse who knows her place. But Colonel Hale is watching her with an intensity that feels like being surveyed by military intelligence. The next afternoon, Katie enters the break room at 14:30, 45 minutes into her shift. She's been running since 6:24 a.m., 7 patients, 2 post-op assessments, 1 medication error caught before it reached the floor, 1 family argument de-escalated in the waiting room. Her lunch is a container of protein and vegetables from the meal prep service she uses on Sundays because cooking requires thinking about a future beyond the next shift. She's not hungry, but eating is a discipline that keeps the body functional. The break room is crowded. Nurse Chen stands at the refrigerator. Nurse Williams occupies one end of the 8-person table. Dr. Martinez leans against the counter with a coffee that steams the air around his face. The fluorescent lights above hum their endless electrical song, and conversations fill the space like oxygen. Katie sets her lunch down at the far end of the table. Nurse Chen removes her sandwich from the refrigerator. She glances at Katie, and Katie nods, a small acknowledgement. Chen collects her lunch and leaves. Rounds coming up, she says to no one in particular. Nurse Williams gathers her coffee and the yogurt she'd been eating. I should check on my post-op, she announces, though her shift notes show all her patients stable. She exits without making eye contact. Dr. Martinez finishes his coffee in 3 swallows and sets the empty cup on the counter. Lots to do, he mutters, and follows. Within 90 seconds, Katie sits alone at a table for 8 with warm chairs still cooling around her. The break room feels larger this way, the silence heavier. She opens her lunch container and eats in the sound of her own chewing and the refrigerator's compressor cycling and nothing else. She doesn't know that Pierce has been working the morning shift since 6:22 a.m., quietly pulling staff into the supply closet, the stairwell, the secluded corner of the parking garage. Between us, I've been concerned about Nurse Morrison's background. Some of the stories she tells about field medicine don't quite add up. Stolen valor, possibly. I've been documenting it, of course. His voice carries the tone of a man performing reluctant concern, the way someone might speak about a colleague they're trying to protect. We're looking into her credentials. Could take weeks. By Friday morning, Katie sees the note before she sees anything else. It's posted on the unit board next to the time clock, printed on official hospital letterhead, her name in the subject line in the particular typography that makes public humiliation look like policy. Disciplinary notice. Nurse K. M. Morrison, insubordination and credential misrepresentation. Incident report. During treatment of General Marcus Hale, Nurse Morrison made unauthorized claims regarding field medical experience and demonstrated insubordination toward attending physician, Dr. James Pierce, MD. Nurse Morrison has repeatedly deviated from established protocols without supervisor approval. Such behavior is inconsistent with St. Michael's standards of professional conduct. Required action, written response within 5 business days. Katie reads it 3 times. The paper is crisp under her fingers, the lettering precise. 12 staff members have already read it. She knows because she counts the slight smudges near the signature line, the edge worn smooth from being passed from hand to hand. She touches the paper once, lets her fingers rest on her own name printed in clinical sans serif, then lowers her hand and walks to room 412. General Hale lies exactly where she left him yesterday, head elevated 20 degrees, left arm in proper alignment with his torso, legs supported by pressure pillows to prevent pressure injuries, the ventilator continuing its mechanical song. Katie checks every line, every reading, every detail with the precision of someone who has nowhere else to be. She doesn't hurry. She doesn't take shortcuts. She performs her assessments with the full attention of someone who has learned that dignity is built in small moments, in the spaces between the public humiliation and the private choice to continue working anyway. She takes one measured breath. She doesn't think about the disciplinary notice. She thinks about the IED blast in Loga province. She thinks about the sound of the explosion, not the movie's version, but the actual sound, the way it rewrites physics and air pressure and the basic architecture of a moment. She thinks about Sergeant Marcus Hale's body, unconscious and bleeding, and the choice she made without choosing, the way her hands moved through muscle memory and training and the kind of clarity that only comes when the alternative isn't negotiable. A single tear escapes. She lets it fall. She doesn't wipe it away immediately, that would be erasure, and she's done with erasing herself. She lets the tear move down her cheek, lets the other staff members who might be watching see it, lets the moment be witnessed. Then she wipes it away with the back of her hand, pressing hard enough that the gesture carries some kind of violence. Her eyes remain locked on the heart monitor readout, on the steady pulse of the general's cardiac rhythm, on the rhythm of a man who might never wake up but whose body she's keeping alive in all the ways that matter. She walks to the nurse's station to document the morning assessment. Dr. Pierce is visible through the glass partition of his office, and when he realizes she's noticed him, he smiles. Not a smile that reaches his eyes. A smile that acknowledges the architecture of power and the particular satisfaction of someone who has learned to build his authority on the isolation of others. She doesn't return it. She returns to her rounds with the kind of quiet dignity that has nothing to do with pride and everything to do with knowing that some people spend their entire careers trying to break you, and the only winning move is to keep working anyway. She checks her next patient's oxygen saturation. She adjusts the bear hugger warming blanket on the post-op recovery bed. She documents medications and adjusts fall rates and answers call lights from patients whose names she carries with her, not as burdens, but as responsibility. By the end of her shift, she's treated 7 patients. She's prevented 2 medication errors. She's held the hand of a man whose wife just left him. She's laughed, actually laughed, the dry kind, when her difficult patient made a joke about hospital jello tasting like a dishwasher's fever dream. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 months later, in the exact moment when Katie's isolation had become so complete that she'd begun to understand it as the new architecture of her life, when she'd accepted the empty break room tables and the conversations that died when she entered and the looks from staff who decided her based on a typewritten narrative they didn't question. The worst part came on a Wednesday morning in March when federal marshals arrived at St. Michael's with a prisoner, a shackled patient with eyes like coal and a history that made the Marines guarding him keep their hands visible and their bodies between him and everyone else. And Katie had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. No idea that the prisoner had been at Bagram. No idea that he would recognize her the moment she entered his room. No idea that everything Pierce had built to bury her was about to collapse in a single moment of identification, in a whispered word in Pashto that would change the entire geometry of the hospital's power structure forever. 3 months into Pierce's campaign, Katie Morrison had become a ghost that moved through St. Michael's in a white coat, invisible even when standing directly in front of people. The whisper network that Pierce had seeded with such precision had taken root like fungus through the unit. Conversation stopped when she approached the break room, her lunch container untouched on the counter while 3 nurses collected their meals and drifted away as though the air around her had turned toxic. She'd taken to eating in her car in the parking lot, engine off, staring at the rain-streaked windshield while scanning the shift rotation board on her phone, trying to figure out which hours the ER would be busiest so she could at least be useful somewhere, doing something that mattered. The formal written reprimand still hung in her employee file like a guillotine blade: insubordination, credential misrepresentation, unauthorized medical decision-making, each phrase carefully constructed by Pierce to sound damning while remaining just vague enough that human resources had no choice but to honor the documentation. She worked 72-hour stretches because it was easier than going home to an apartment that still smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes and regret. General Marcus Hale's room, room 412, 3rd floor, East Wing, had become the only place where her hands felt steady. She'd spent 6 months learning the subtle rhythms of his breathing, the precise angle required for his right shoulder to prevent the surgical scar from tightening, the exact pressure needed when turning him to prevent strain on the healing structures the IED blast had left fragmented beneath his skin. Her repositioning protocol had been flawless: 6 months without a single pressure ulcer, without contracture, without the 100 small indignities that consumed comatose patients in hospital beds. She knew the exact moment his eyes moved behind closed lids. She knew the cadence of his heart like a second language. She knew him better than any doctor in this building, and that knowledge had become her only currency. Then Pierce moved her. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, typed in the clinical precision that Pierce had perfected, a memo in her employee portal at 6:44 a.m., before the day's shift even started. Effective immediately, Staff Rotation Optimization has designated registered nurse Katie Morrison for assignment to Pediatric Medicine, 3rd floor West Wing. This reassignment reflects current departmental needs and ensures equitable distribution of high-acuity experience across multiple units. For sentences: 0 explanation. A copy to HR, to the unit director, to the chief nursing officer. The language of hospitals, which could bury you without ever raising a voice. She found Pierce at the nursing station when she arrived, pulling up the new assignment on the central system as though he'd been expecting this exact moment. His expression was composed, the kind of professional courtesy that predators wear when they know they've already won. Katie approached him with her hand steady, her voice level, the voice she used when discussing patient care, never personal, never accusatory, just the practical mechanics of medicine. General Hale's positioning protocol requires consistency, Katie said. 10 words. Maximum efficiency. Any disruption in his turning schedule could compromise the surgical sites. Pierce didn't look up from the computer screen. His care will be managed by the float staff, he said, his fingers moving across the keyboard with theatrical precision. Staff rotation requirements mandate equitable distribution of assignments. Hospital Policy AR 47, subsection 12, clearly states that no single nurse may maintain primary assignment to any patient beyond 6 months without documented justification for specialized care. He pulled up the policy document and rotated the monitor toward her, a dense block of hospital bureaucracy, the kind that had been written by people who'd never touched a patient, designed by administration to ensure that continuity could be sacrificed on the altar of cost efficiency. Katie read it. Of course it was real. Pierce didn't work with approximations. He worked with the architecture of institutions, with the precise instruments of policy and documentation that made it impossible to argue without sounding insubordinate. His sternum compression sites are still healing, Katie said. Standard repositioning techniques could. The float staff will receive a briefing, Pierce interrupted, still not looking at her. You'll document your protocol. Pediatrics is waiting for you. Room assignment sheet is in your mailbox. The tone wasn't cruel. That was what made it worse. It was the tone you'd use discussing a supply order or a schedule conflict, the tone that made everything sound inevitable, reasonable, the way things were simply done in institutions where systems mattered more than the person lying in room 412 with his heart still beating against the odds. Katie turned and walked to pediatrics without responding. She documented everything: 6 pages of repositioning protocol, turning frequency, pressure point management, the specific angle required for shoulder mobility, the warning signs of infection that nobody else was watching for. She left the documentation on General Hale's chart where the float staff would never think to read it, and then she took her assigned room on the West Wing, where the walls were painted with cartoons and the children screamed about things that would heal. The float staff who took over General Hale's care were competent enough, licensed, experienced, moving through the IED blast victims' recovery with the same professional distance they brought to every other patient. They performed repositioning every 4 hours instead of every 3. They didn't notice when his breathing pattern shifted. They didn't track the subtle changes in his skin temperature or the way his fingers seemed to curl tighter in his palms. They were good at their jobs. They just weren't tracking the 1,000 tiny variables that meant the difference between healing and slow, invisible deterioration. 3 weeks into the reassignment, Katie was changing sheets in the pediatric unit when she passed the central monitoring station and saw something that stopped her hands mid-motion. General Hale's cardiac telemetry was displayed on the corner monitor, a routine screen shared across departments for patient oversight. His rhythm had changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would trigger alarms. But the regular sinus rhythm she'd been monitoring for 6 months had developed an irregular pattern, a subtle dysrhythmia, the kind that might indicate his heart was beginning to compensate for something. A structural problem. An infection. A failing repair beneath the surface that nobody had been trained to see. She stared at the monitor for 8 seconds, then continued changing the pediatric sheets. She pulled the call bell cord aside. She washed her hands. She walked to the break room and poured coffee into a cup that tasted like cardboard, and she said nothing to anyone, because saying something would mean admitting she'd been watching, which would mean confirming that Pierce had been right to reassign her, that her obsessive documentation and her unauthorized protocols had been the problem, not the solution. But that afternoon, during her break, she accessed the electronic health record from a terminal in the pediatric supply room and reviewed General Hale's cardiac rhythms from the past 72 hours. The dysrhythmia was escalating. The intervals were becoming increasingly irregular. His QRS complex was starting to widen. No alarm had been triggered because he was stable, blood pressure holding at 118/72, oxygen saturation at 98%, no fever, no obvious crisis. Just a subtle electrical storm building inside his chest, the kind that could announce itself with a catastrophic arrhythmia if the wrong thing happened at the wrong time. Katie closed the chart and returned to pediatrics. She performed her assigned tasks with precision, checked falls, administered medications, soothed a 7-year-old with a broken femur who was frightened of the dark. A nurse in pediatrics was nothing like a nurse in trauma, nothing like a nurse who'd once held a bleeding sergeant's hand in the dust while rounds snapped past like angry insects. This work was important. It mattered. And yet her mind remained tethered to room for 12, to the subtle changes she couldn't unsee, to the cascade failure she could predict but not prevent. Pierce scheduled a routine assessment of General Hale for 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Katie saw the appointment notation in the system when she was charting her pediatric patients. Routine vitals, brief neurological exam, standard protocol for a patient 2 years into coma recovery. Dr. Pierce would examine him, document stable condition, and leave. Nobody would notice the dysrhythmia because nobody else had been trained to look for it. Nobody would catch the deterioration until something broke, and by then it would be catastrophic. She finished her shift at 4 p.m. and drove home to an apartment that was still someone else's, sat on a bed that didn't belong to her, and waited for her phone to alert her to what came next. She couldn't prevent it. She couldn't intervene. She could only watch the cascade begin and hope that when the moment arrived, her hands would remember what her mind was no longer permitted to do. But that wasn't the worst part. The routine assessment was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. Pierce had made the arrangements himself, ensuring Katie was reassigned to pediatrics that morning, her name removed from General Hale's chart with a single administrative keystroke. The resident assigned to the assessment was Marcus Webb, competent but cautious, the kind of doctor who consulted the manual before trusting his instincts. Pierce knew this. He had chosen Webb deliberately. Katie knew something was wrong the moment the overhead system chimed at 13:19. She was replacing an 4-line in a 5-year-old when her phone buzzed, a text from Janet, one of the few nurses who still spoke to her, Hale's monitor showing irregular rhythms. P waves scattered. Pierce pulled you off his care. Katie's hand stilled over the child's arm. The dysrhythmias she had warned about, the one she had tried to document before her reassignment, were accelerating. She had 13 minutes before the assessment began. 13 minutes to do nothing. She finished the 4, documented the time, and walked to the break room. The coffee was hours old, cold as betrayal. She poured it anyway and stared at the monitor feed on her phone, the one she wasn't supposed to access but had kept logged in through a friend's credentials. General Hale's cardiac rhythm scrolled across the screen in erratic waves. Not normal. Not stable. The kind of deterioration that announced itself only to people trained to listen. At 14:02, her phone lit up. Code blue. Room for 12. Katie moved without decision. Her body understood before her mind caught up. She was moving toward the stairwell when she heard the overhead, Code blue, 4th floor. Code blue, room for 12. Her legs carried her faster. 2 flights. 3rd floor. 4th floor. The door to 412 was already surrounded, 3 nurses, 2 residents, Dr. Pierce standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, watching like a man who had already written the ending. General Hale's monitor showed flat line. Complete asystole. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm, but his heart had stopped. Resident Webb stood frozen at the bedside, his hands hovering over Hale's sternum, calculating. Katie saw the hesitation, the calculation, the fear crossing his face. She knew why. Hale's sternum had been compromised by 2 years of immobility, decades of special forces operations, and the original blast damage that had stolen his consciousness in the first place. Standard CPR compressions could fracture it. Kill him faster than asystole. Stop. Katie's voice cut through the code like a scalpel. His sternum can't take standard compressions. Pierce's head snapped toward her. Nurse Morrison, you are not assigned to this unit. Security. But Hale's monitor flatlined again. Completely dead. No rhythm. No hope without intervention. Katie stepped to the bed, and every person in the room understood in that moment that they were standing next to someone who had done this before. I need a surgical tray. Scalpel, forceps, retractor. Her voice had dropped an octave. The deferential nurse was gone. What remained was something older, harder, lethal with precision. And I need them now. One of the nurses moved without waiting for permission. She understood. Katie's hands were already moving, stripping off her regular gloves, snapping on sterile ones in a single fluid motion that looked like a ritual. Her fingers found the landmarks on Hale's chest. 2nd rib. 3rd intercostal space. Left side. Anterolateral approach. The muscle memory didn't require thought. It required only permission. The scalpel was there. Katie didn't remember anyone handing it to her, but it was in her hand, and her hands knew what to do. The blade found the space between ribs with the precision of 1,000 training hours, of muscle fiber that had learned in darkness and fire what it meant to save a life with nothing but a knife and will. The incision was clean. Confident. A surgeon would have recognized it immediately. A nurse would never perform it. Blood welled. The hiss of air escaping as she opened the pleural space, letting lung collapse slightly to expose the pericardium beneath. Her left hand spread the ribs, gentle but firm, the kind of strength that came from carrying wounded men 2 kilometers through gunfire. Her right hand found the pericardial sac and opened it with the scalpel. One motion. She laid the knife aside without looking at it. General Hale's heart lay exposed in her hands. Katie's fingers found it, wrapped around the ventricle, and began. Not compressions. Massage. Direct cardiac massage. She could feel the muscle beneath her fingertips, warm, still, silent. She massaged it like it was the only thing that mattered in the world, because it was. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Her rhythm was perfect. Her breathing controlled. The monitor showed nothing but flat line, but her hands continued. 30 seconds. 60. 90. 1 milligram epinephrine 4, Katie said, her voice steady as surgical steel. Push it now. The medication went in. The monitor remained flat. Katie's hands continued their rhythm, and it was like watching someone speak a language no one else remembered. The code team had stopped moving. Resident Webb had stepped back. Nurse Patterson had stopped writing. Dr. Pierce's smile had vanished completely, replaced by something that looked like fear. 110 seconds. 115. Katie's hands continued their massage, and General Marcus Hale's heart, the heart that had beaten through 2 years of coma, through IED blasts and desert storms and impossible survival, flickered. The monitor showed a single electrical impulse. Chaotic. Barely alive. 2 minutes of compressions, Katie commanded. Keep him warm. I need a suction catheter. Someone moved. The hands belonged to Webb now. He understood the work, understood that he was assisting someone who had done this in places he could only imagine. Katie continued the direct massage while Webb cleared fluid from the surgical field. 30 more seconds. The monitor showed another beat. Another. Irregular but present. Chaotic but alive. He's got rhythm, Webb said, his voice carrying the tone of someone witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Weak but present. Katie continued for another 20 seconds, letting the rhythm strengthen under her hands. Then she stepped back with the precision of a soldier standing down from a mission. Her hands were blood to the elbows. Her scrubs were saturated. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't shaking. She looked at Resident Webb and spoke with the kind of authority that made him stand taller. Prepare for closure. Small continuous suture, 4.0 absorbable. Monitor for pneumothorax. She turned to the nursing staff. He's stable. Continue monitoring. Vitals every 5 minutes. 12 pairs of eyes watched her step back from the bed. The room went absolutely silent except for the monitor's steady beep and the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. Nurse Patterson whispered something to Webb. Katie didn't hear the words, but she heard the meaning. How did a nurse perform open cardiac surgery? How did a nurse know a field thoracotomy? How did a nurse's hands move like they had practiced this in actual combat zones? Dr. Pierce stood motionless at the foot of the bed, his face the color of old parchment. He understood. Katie saw the recognition cross his features, the moment when he realized he hadn't been dealing with a competent nurse he could contain, but with something far larger and far more dangerous. His institutional power suddenly felt very small. Katie removed her gloves without looking at anyone. She walked to the sink, washed her hands with the meticulousness of ritual, and when she turned back, she made brief eye contact with Dr. Pierce. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply walked past him and out of the room. By 1730, the termination papers were waiting in her locker. By 1845, Dr. Pierce had personally delivered a stack of forms to her apartment, his smile restored now that he had regained his footing, that he had converted a miracle into a violation. You saved his life, and it's going to cost you everything, he had said, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a man who had already won. Hospital board complaint. Practicing medicine without a license. Criminal investigation flagged. Credential misrepresentation. Katie had taken the papers without comment and closed the door. At 3:14, she sat alone in a corner booth of a diner on the edge of Norfolk, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed like insects and the coffee had been hot sometime in the previous decade. Her uniform was gone. Her badge was gone. Her employment was gone. The folded flag from her fallen teammate, Sergeant James Torres, the one whose name she could never speak aloud, whose empty coffin she had never been permitted to mourn, was pressed against her chest beneath her jacket. pressed where her heart was, where it had been since Bagram, since the explosion, since the moment she had carried 3 wounded operators 2 kilometers through gunfire and been officially declared dead for her trouble. She stared at her reflection in the diner window. The woman looking back was hollow. Not from fear, or fear required a future to be afraid of. She was hollow from the knowledge that she had just revealed everything, that 12 hospital staff members now knew she was something other than what she had claimed to be, that Dr. Pierce would use this knowledge like a weapon until she was completely destroyed. Her phone was on the table. Powered down. No calls coming in. No one from Walter Reed. No one from the Pentagon. No one from the military structure that had told her 8 years ago, "You are dead. There is no record of your service. If you surface, if you speak, if you tell anyone what happened in Bagram, the consequences will be absolute." She had followed those instructions perfectly. She had been a ghost. A nurse. A nothing. And then she had saved a 4-star general, and everything had burned. The coffee was cold. Katie didn't drink it. She simply held the cup and waited for morning, understanding that when it came, her entire world would either rebuild itself or cease to exist completely. But that wasn't the worst part. The conference room at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and fear. Katie sat across from the hospital's attorney at 8 a.m., her hands folded on the table, her voice steady as a surgical laser. The folder between them was an inch thick. Negligence. Practicing beyond scope. Criminal endangerment. Every form Dr. Pierce had filed was color-coded, highlighted, annotated with his precise handwriting like he'd built a museum to his own vindication. He sat in the corner, arms folded across his chest, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The kind of smile a wolf shows before it thinks it's won. "Captain Morrison," the attorney began, then stopped. "I mean, Ms. Morrison. The incident in General Hale's room constitutes a violation of." The conference room door opened. 2 Marines in dress uniforms entered, their movements synchronized like they shared the same skeleton. Between them walked a man in shackles, his orange custody suit hanging loose on his frame, his eyes dark and focused. A Taliban commander. Federal custody. The attorney froze mid-sentence. Pierce's smile evaporated like sweat under a desert sun. The prisoner's eyes locked onto Katie's face. He said one word in Pashto, his voice like gravel scraped through broken glass, "Malaki Bagram." The angel of Bagram. The room went dead silent. The lead Marine, a master sergeant with a scar that ran from temple to jaw, stepped forward. His name tape read, Graves. His bearing suggested he'd forgotten how to be anything but a weapon pointed in the direction command suggested. He placed a folder on the conference table without speaking. The attorney reached for it. Pierce didn't move. Inside was a single page, declassified. The redactions were minimal. What remained was enough. Captain Catherine Eleanor Morrison. Silver Star. Citation, for extraordinary heroism under fire, Bagram Airfield, August 2019. Subject carried 3 wounded operators, including Sergeant First Class Marcus Hale, 2 kilometers through sustained enemy fire after convoy destruction. Graves read it aloud like a courtroom record. His voice had the weight of someone who'd been there. Sergeant Davis, Petty Officer Chen, and General Hale. All 3 survived because of her. 2 of them deployed again. One of them became a general. The attorney looked at Katie. Katie's expression didn't change. "There's more," Graves said. The wheelchair arrived before the Marine finished the sentence. General Hale sat in it, his body still bearing the wreckage of 18 months of recovery, but his spine straight and his eyes clear. His right arm trembled slightly as he raised it to his forehead, a salute. Not casual. Not ceremonial. A soldier's acknowledgement of a soldier who'd kept him alive twice. Pierce stood up. "This is fraud," he said, his voice climbing toward something between rage and desperation. "That citation is classified. She's impersonating." "No one's impersonating anyone," a new voice said. The Pentagon liaison stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit, her credentials dangling from her neck like a sword. Her name was Dr. Reeves. She was the kind of woman who made entire careers disappear through paperwork alone. Behind her stood two federal agents. Behind them, someone with an audio recorder and a hospital badge. "Dr. Pierce," Reeves said, her voice like winter air moving through a refrigerator, "your investigation into Captain Morrison triggered an automated flag in our database. As part of that flag, we reviewed your patient files. All of them. 14 cases stood out." She set 14 folders on the conference table. Each one was an inch thick. Each one had a name tab. Case 1, 2014, patient Rodriguez. You ordered a 10 mg morphine dose when the chart indicated allergy. Patient coded. Blamed on nursing error. Insurance settlement, non-disclosure agreement. Pierce's face went the color of old bone. Case 2, 2016, patient Chen, no relation. You missed attention pneumothorax for 6 hours. Blamed on delayed radiology reporting. Family paid to stay quiet. Case 3, 2017, patient Walker. You discharged a patient with compartment syndrome. 3-day delay in readmission. Patient lost her leg. The documentation you filed blamed the ER physician for initial triage. Graves looked at Pierce the way a sniper views distance. Calculating. Dispassionate. Certain. Cases for through 14 follow the same pattern, Reeves continued. Negligent care. Falsified documentation. Nursing staff blamed. And in 2 cases, cases 7 and 11, the negligence resulted in death. The attorney's face had gone pale. She reached for the Rodriguez file. Her hand shook. "That's sealed," Pierce said, but his voice was a whisper now, the authority draining out like blood from a wound. "Not anymore," Reeves said. "The families have been contacted. Case 7, Mrs. Rodriguez, lost her husband because of a medication error you made and then blamed on your night nurse. That nurse, by the way, is now working at Johns Hopkins and has never had a complaint filed against her in 15 years of service. Case 11, Mr. Walker, he was 16 years old. He should have been able to graduate high school. Instead, he died from your delayed diagnosis covered up by your paperwork." The rotor wash of a helicopter shook the hospital windows. It was close. Coming closer. "You've been flagged for criminal investigation," Reeves said. "Your medical privileges at this institution are suspended effective immediately pending review by the state board. Federal agents will be conducting interviews with your staff within the hour. And Dr. Pierce, when this deposition concludes, you're going to speak with the attorneys in this room, because you're facing 2 counts of negligent homicide, and your best option is cooperation." Pierce opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Katie stood slowly. Her chair scraped backward with a sound like bone on tile. She looked at Graves. She looked at General Hale. She looked at the Taliban commander still watching her with the eyes of someone who'd survived by learning to recognize the difference between a person and a predator. Then she looked at Pierce. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the steady gaze of a soldier who'd stared down worse enemies and lived to walk away from them. "I have to finish this paperwork," she said quietly. "Then I'm going to go home, sleep for 12 hours, and report to Walter Reed on Monday." "Captain," Graves said, "your discharge status was fraudulently recorded," Reeves finished. "We're correcting it. You're restored to active duty as of 0600 hours today. Medical discharge status annulled. Service record amended. You exist again, Captain Morrison. Officially." The words hung in the air like oxygen being pumped into a room that had been suffocating in the dark. Katie's hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But something shifted in her posture, a weight lifting that no one except another soldier would recognize. The weight of being a ghost. The weight of pretending to be less than you were. 6 months later, she stood at Arlington National Cemetery in her dress uniform. The folded flag rested against her chest, the flag that had been folded over the casket of Sergeant First Class Maria Chen, the combat medic who died covering Katie's escape from Bagram 2 years ago. The same flag Katie had carried every day since, pressed against her heart in a locker room at St. Michael's, a reminder of what sacrifice looked like when it wasn't recorded, recognized, or remembered by anyone but the person it saved. General Hale stood beside her, recovered enough to render full honors. His hand was still weak, but it rose steadily to salute as Katie knelt and placed the flag on the grave. Maria Chen. Combat medic. Friend. The woman who taught Katie that some debts can't be repaid, only honored. Katie touched the gravestone and didn't move for a long time. When she stood, Hale was waiting with his good arm extended. She took it. They stood together at the grave of someone who died so that others could live. Across the city, in a community college gymnasium in Norfolk, Dr. Pierce stood in front of 16 students holding a CPR practice dummy. His name was no longer on the roster. The position was titled CPR Instructor, Unaffiliated. His teaching assistant mentioned a news story about a decorated Special Forces nurse at Walter Reed. Pierce adjusted the practice dummy's chest compression pads without looking up. He didn't say anything. He hadn't said much of anything since the federal charges were filed, since his medical license was revoked, since the nursing staff he'd scapegoated came forward with their stories. He taught CPR because the community college was willing to hire him for minimum wage, and because he had no other option. The students never learned his name. The position paid $18 an hour. Katie's first week at Walter Reed, she stood in front of the trauma rotation training the next generation of military medics. She taught with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine in a forward operating base under fire, who understood that hesitation cost lives. A young nurse, barely 24, fresh out of civilian training, asked Katie during a break, "How do you know all this? Your record says community college, but you perform like you learned at SOCOM." Katie set down her coffee. The smell of antiseptic and equipment oil filled the small office. She looked at the nurse the way Graves had looked at Pierce, not with judgment, but with the clarity of someone who'd learned to see the truth beneath surfaces. "Experience," Katie said. "Real experience. The kind that doesn't go on a resume. The kind that costs something." She paused. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Don't let anyone convince you your experience doesn't count just because it doesn't fit in a box on a form." The nurse nodded slowly, understanding more than the words contained. Through the window of Katie's office, wounded soldiers walked between buildings. Some limped. Some moved in wheelchairs. Some looked like they were carrying invisible weight that no crutch could support. They received care from staff who knew exactly who'd trained them. Staff who understood that competence couldn't be erased by paperwork, by whispers, by someone else's fear of being outshined by talent they didn't possess. Katie pulled up the Walter Reed roster. 16 new trauma nurses this quarter. 16 people who would learn from her that medicine wasn't about credentials or pedigree or how well you played the institutional game. It was about your hands. Your knowledge. Your willingness to move when everyone else froze. She opened the first training file. Outside, Norfolk stretched toward the horizon. The hospital where Dr. Pierce had tried to destroy her was 3 miles away, teaching rounds happening in real time, new attendings arriving, the machine grinding on. But that wasn't Katie's world anymore. Her world was here, in the precision of military medicine, in the training of people who'd save lives in places where paperwork meant nothing and competence was the only language that mattered. She didn't think about Pierce. She didn't have to. His investigation had built a trail straight to his own negligence. His own documentation had damned him. He'd weaponized the system so effectively against her that when the system finally turned around and looked at him, it saw everything. Some people think justice requires a moment of satisfaction, a confrontation, a final reckoning. But Katie understood something deeper. Justice wasn't a moment. It was what happened when the truth finally surfaced, when the paperwork was reviewed, when the people who'd been silenced were finally heard. Justice was walking into a hospital in your dress uniform and knowing that every nurse who'd been scapegoated by that man would see it. That every patient he'd harmed would know he'd been held accountable. That every future victim would be protected by the very system he'd tried to corrupt. Justice was going home and sleeping without ghosts. Katie stood and walked toward the training room. 16 new nurses were waiting to learn from a woman who'd carried wounded soldiers through fire, performed emergency surgery with a knife in her hands, and somehow survived 2 years of being erased from her own existence. They would learn because she was going to teach them. And they would survive because she was going to make sure they did. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. That wasn't a quote. That was a mission statement. If you loved this story about unrecognized heroism and justice served through competence instead of confrontation, please subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you do if you had to choose between keeping a secret and saving a life?